During a gala, a wealthy man openly mocks his black maid, viewing her as nothing more than entertainment for his guests. But when she bravely takes the microphone, her speech captivates the crowd, stealing the spotlight and shaming her employer. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under crystal chandeliers, a sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos filling the space. The annual Whitman Foundation Gala represented everything Charles Whitman believed about power. It was meant to be displayed, flaunted, and used to remind others of their place in the social hierarchy. Charles Whitman stood at the podium, his 6-foot frame wrapped in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than what most of his employees earned in 3 months. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his white teeth gleamed as he tapped the microphone, commanding attention from the crowd of New York's elite. "Welcome, welcome," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced charm of someone used to being listened to. "Another year, another few billion." He paused for the expected laughter, which rippled through the crowd right on cue. "You know, speaking of money, my housekeeping staff recently asked for a raise." He adjusted his bow tie, eyes scanning the room. "I told them I already pay them more than they'd make in their home countries. Isn't that generous enough?" More laughter, though slightly more hesitant this time. Near the back of the room, Tiana Williams continued her rounds with a tray of champagne flutes, her black uniform marking her as part of the service staff. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray as Charles's words reached her ears. "Just yesterday, my head maid, you'll see her serving drinks, the one with the braids, she told me she's taking online college classes." Charles chuckled, raising his eyebrows. "I said, sweetheart, stick to what you know. Some people are meant to serve, and others are meant to be served." Tiana's face remained neutral, a mask she'd perfected over years of service. She'd learned to compartmentalize, to separate the person who dreamed of opening her own art gallery from the woman who served drinks to people who saw her as nothing more than part of the hotel's decor. Her mother's voice echoed in her head. "Keep your dignity, baby. No one can take that from you unless you let them." As she moved between the tables, Tiana's mind drifted to her small apartment in Harlem, where half-finished paintings lined the walls. Her daughter's college acceptance letter was pinned to the refrigerator. NYU, full academic scholarship. The same daughter who was working 2 jobs to help with living expenses, determined not to let her mother shoulder the burden alone. In the crowd, Ruth Chun, a prominent civil rights attorney, watched the scene unfold. Her hand clenched around her clutch, knuckles white with tension. She recognized the look on Tiana's face. She'd warned herself early in her career, when senior partners would mistake her for the paralegal or ask her to fetch coffee during meetings. Ruth observed how the other guests responded to Charles's jokes. Some laughed openly, others shifted uncomfortably but remained silent, and a few, very few, frowned in disapproval. She noted faces, names, potential allies. 20 years of fighting discrimination in court had taught her that change required strategy, timing, and the right pressure points. The opening speech continued, each joke landing like a slap. Tiana maintained her professional smile, but Ruth could see the slight tremor in her hands as she served another round of drinks. The lawyer recognized the signs of someone reaching their breaking point. The tight shoulders, the carefully measured breathing, the too precise movements. Charles wrapped up his speech with a toast to success and knowing your P. Lace in the world. The crowd raised their glasses, the crystal catching the light and throwing prisms across the walls. As applause filled the room, Ruth noticed how Tiana straightened her spine, lifting her chin slightly, a subtle but clear gesture of defiance. The evening was just beginning, but already the air felt charged with unspoken tensions. In the corner, the band struck up a jazz number, and the crowd began to move toward the dance floor. But beneath the surface of social pleasantries and forced smiles, something was shifting. The night was about to become much more than just another charity gala. Ruth Chun moved through the crowd with practiced ease, her red evening gown marking her as one of them, even as her purpose set her apart. She approached a small group of socialites gathered near the bar, recognizing several board members of prominent civil rights organizations among them. "That speech was rather distasteful, don't you think?" she ventured, testing the waters. The response was immediate but disappointing. "Oh, darling, Charles is just old school," laughed Miranda Peterson, wife of a hedge fund manager. She adjusted her diamond necklace, barely glancing at Ruth. "Besides, did you see the new Valentino collection? Simply divine." Speaking of divine, another woman chimed in. "I heard the Met Gala this year will be." Ruth watched as her attempt at meaningful conversation dissolved into gossip. These were the same people who attended her fundraisers, who wrote checks for diversity initiatives, who posted about social justice on their social media accounts. Yet here, in this gilded ballroom, they chose comfort over confrontation. Across the room, Theo Martinez stood by one of the tall windows, his artist's eye taking in the scene. At 32, he was one of the younger guests, invited because his recent series on wealth inequality had caught the attention of several influential galleries. His presence here was meant to be a token of the Whitman Foundation's support for diverse voices in art. Theo's fingers itched for his sketchbook as he watched Tiana navigate the crowd. There was something in her movements, a contained grace, a silent dignity that spoke volumes. He recognized the complexity of her position, having spent years as the promising minority artist at similar events before his recent success. The music shifted to a slower tempo, and Tiana paused near the dessert table, allowing herself a moment's rest. Her mind wandered to the small studio she rented in a converted warehouse, where she painted late into the night after her shifts. The canvases there told stories of resilience, of dreams deferred but not abandoned, of the beauty she found in everyday struggles. Theo noticed how she looked at the art on the walls, not with the practiced appreciation of the other guests, but with the critical eye of a fellow artist. He'd seen her work once at a small community gallery in Harlem. The pieces had struck him with their raw honesty, their unflinching portrayal of life on society's margins. The evening's photographer approached, asking members of the board to gather for a photo. "Oh, Charles is such a character," one board member chuckled to another. "But you can't deny he knows how to raise money." Ruth overheard this exchange and felt her professional mask slip slightly. She'd spent her career watching people justify discrimination in the name of pragmatism. "The system works," they'd say, even as it ground down people like Tiana. A young socialite reached for a champagne flute from Tiana's tray, accidentally knocking another glass over. The champagne spilled across Tiana's uniform. "Oh, sorry," the socialite said dismissively, already turning back to her conversation. Tiana felt the cold liquid seep through the fabric, but her expression never changed. She'd learned long ago that showing reaction only gave them more power. Still, something was different tonight. Charles's words, the spilled champagne, the years of swallowed pride, it was all building to something. The band began playing "What a Wonderful World," the irony lost on most of the crowd. Theo moved closer to where Tiana was discreetly trying to dry her uniform. He reached for a napkin, offering it without words. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Ruth observed this interaction, noting how these small moments of solidarity were building throughout the evening. She'd seen enough movements start this way, with quiet gestures, shared glances, the gradual recognition that change was not just possible but necessary. The night was still young, but the atmosphere had shifted. Beneath the surface of polite society, currents of discontent were gathering strength. Tiana stood straighter, something resolving in her expression. The time for silence was coming to an end. The moment Tiana decided to act came during Charles Whitman's second speech of the evening. He stood at the podium again, champagne in hand, preparing to announce the foundation's yearly donations. The room quieted, crystal glasses tinkling as servers. Her colleagues continued their endless circuits with fresh drinks. "You know," Charles drawled, loose from too much champagne, "people ask me why I don't automate our service staff. Technology these days." He gestured broadly, nearly spilling his drink. "But I tell them, where's the charm in that? Besides, some of our staff have been with us so long, they're practically antiques themselves." More laughter, more forced smiles. Tiana stood near the kitchen entrance, her damp uniform still carrying the sharp scent of champagne. 15 years of service. 15 years of biting her tongue, of playing the role expected of her. She thought of her daughter's words from that morning. "Mom, you always tell me to stand up for myself. When was the last time you did that for yourself?" Her hands trembled as she set down her serving tray. A younger server reached for her arm, whispering, "Tiana, don't. You need this job." But something had shifted inside her, like a lock finally breaking after years of pressure. Ruth watched intently from her table, recognizing the signs of someone reaching their breaking point. She'd seen it in countless clients, that moment when dignity finally outweighed fear. She pulled out her phone, discreetly pressing record. Experience had taught her the value of documentation. Theo, sensing the change in atmosphere, moved closer to the stage. His fingers instinctively reached for the small sketchbook in his jacket pocket. Artists live for moments like these, when reality cracked and truth seeped through. Tiana moved through the crowd with steady steps. The path to the stage felt endless, each step carrying the weight of years of silence. Conversations quieted as she passed, her black uniform stark against the evening gowns and tuxedos. She wasn't supposed to be seen, not really. She was supposed to be part of the background, like the potted plants and covered chairs. Charles was mid-sentence when Tiana reached the stage. "And so, I say to our critics," he stopped, finally noticing her presence. "Ah, Tiana, more champagne? Though perhaps you should change first." Another wave of uncomfortable laughter rippled through the crowd. Tiana didn't respond to his attempt at humor. Instead, she walked directly to the second microphone, the one meant for the evening's musical performance. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that comes before storms. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "For 15 years, I've served at your events. I've listened to your jokes, endured your comments, smiled when you made me the punchline of your stories." Charles's face reddened. "Now, Tiana, this isn't the time or place." "When is the time, Mr. Whitman?" Her voice grew stronger. "When is the place? While I'm cleaning your office? While I'm serving your guests? While I'm being your antique?" Ruth stood slowly, her phone still recording. Other guests began to shift in their seats, some uncomfortable, others intrigued. The other servers stopped their rounds, gathering at the edges of the room, witnesses to something unprecedented. "I have a name," Tiana continued. "I have dreams. I have a daughter in college. I paint. I create. I am not your prop or your punchline. I am not here for your entertainment." The first person to applaud was an elderly woman in the front row. She began slowly, deliberately, her jeweled hands coming together with quiet dignity. Ruth joined next, then Theo. The applause spread like waves, uncertain at first, then growing in strength. Charles remained frozen at the podium, his usual smooth control cracking. He looked to his regular supporters, but found many of them joining the applause. The power dynamic in the room was shifting, like a tide pulling away from familiar shores. Tiana stood straight, her voice clear in the microphone. Years of suppressed words were finally finding their way out, and she wasn't finished. The night was about to take an even more dramatic turn, and everyone in that ballroom could feel it. The evening had shifted from a display of wealth and power to something else entirely. A moment of truth that would force everyone present to confront their own role in maintaining the status quo. The real storm was just beginning. Charles Whitman lunged for the microphone, his composure shattering like fine china. "That's quite enough," he snapped, but his usual authority had lost its edge. "Security," he called out, but the guards stationed at the doors remained still, caught between protocols and conscience. "No, Mr. Whitman, it's not enough," Tiana continued, her grip firm on her microphone. "Let me tell you about last Tuesday. You held a board meeting in your office while I cleaned. You and the board members discussed cutting health benefits for domestic staff because, in your words, they should be grateful for what they get." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces reddening. One woman in an emerald dress quickly gathered her belongings and slipped toward the exit. "You don't know what you're talking about," Charles sputtered, but Tiana pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I know exactly what I'm talking about. I know about the illegal overtime you never paid. I know about Maria, who you fired when she got pregnant because it wasn't convenient for your schedule. I know about the racist comments you make when you think none of us understand English well enough to comprehend them. Ruth moved closer to the stage, her phone still recording. As a civil rights attorney, she recognized the legal implications of each accusation. More importantly, she saw the years of documented injustices bubbling to the surface. "This is slander," Charles shouted, looking desperately to his usual allies. But the crowd had changed. The same people who had laughed at his jokes earlier now stared at their champagne glasses, avoiding his gaze. Tiana reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out a small notebook. May 15th, Mr. Whitman tells Mr. Henderson that these people don't deserve raises because they'll just waste it. June 3rd, Mrs. Whitman suggests that we should be tested for drugs because some cash went missing from her purse. It was later found in her other bag. The notebook was small, worn, filled with dates, times, and incidents. 15 years of careful documentation, written in margins and on breaks, a testament to systematic degradation. You think we don't notice? You think we don't feel? Every time you make a joke about my intelligence while I'm serving your guests, I remember my daughter's Dean's List certificate. Every time you mock my accent, which I don't even have, I think of my father, who taught literature before he had to flee his country. Charles attempted to interrupt again, but his words were drowned out by the growing murmurs of the crowd. The power balance had shifted, and he was losing control of his carefully curated audience. "When you talk about people knowing their place," Tiana continued, "I think about my place. My place is not at your feet, Mr. Whitman. My place is not in the shadows of your parties. My place is wherever I choose to stand." A young woman at table 7 started to cry quietly. An older gentleman near the back nodded slowly, perhaps remembering his own family's immigrant story. The other servers stood straighter, their uniforms no longer marking them as invisible. "You want to talk about knowing our place?" Tiana's voice carried years of restrained dignity. "Let's talk about your place. Your place built on our bent backs. Your place maintained by our silenced voices. Your place secured by our forced smiles." Charles's face had turned from red to purple. He grabbed for the microphone again, but his expensive leather shoe slipped on the polished stage. He stumbled, catching himself on the podium, his carefully maintained image crumbling in front of New York's elite. "I will not be lectured by the help," he shouted, but his words echoed in a room that had changed. The phrases that once drew sycophantic laughter now revealed their ugly truth. Theo had moved to the front, his sketchbook open, capturing the scene in quick, decisive strokes. The contrast between Tiana's dignity and Charles's unraveling control, the shifting expressions in the crowd, the moment when power began to redistribute itself. The night was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. The carefully maintained veneer of polite society had cracked, revealing the rot beneath. And in that crack, something new was beginning to grow. Something that would shake the foundations of Charles Whitman's carefully constructed world. Theo's hands moved across his sketchbook with feverish intensity, each stroke capturing the electric atmosphere of the room. His artistic eye saw what others might miss. The way Charles's perfectly tailored jacket now hung awkwardly on his hunched shoulders, the proud lift of Tiana's chin, the ripple of awareness moving through the crowd like wind through tall grass. He wasn't just drawing scenes. He was documenting a revolution in real time. His quick sketches captured servers standing straighter, guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats, the uncertain expressions of security guards by the doors. Each image told a story of power structures beginning to crack. "What you're witnessing," Ruth's voice cut through the tension as she stepped forward, "is not just one woman's complaint. This is about systemic abuse of power." Her legal training came through in her precise diction, her measured tone carrying to every corner of the ballroom. Charles attempted to reassert control. "This is a private event, and you are all bound by..." "By what, Mr. Whitman?" "NDAs don't cover workplace discrimination or illegal labor practices." Ruth's smile was sharp as she moved closer to the stage. "And I'm quite certain the Department of Labor would be interested in those overtime records Tiana mentioned." Theo flipped to a new page, his charcoal capturing Ruth's stance, feet planted firmly, head high, every inch the warrior in evening wear. Around her, he sketched the growing crowd of supporters, their bodies language, showing the shift from passive observers to active participants. "You're making a serious mistake," Charles threatened, but his voice wavered. His eyes darted to the phones recording the scene, to the faces of board members who were suddenly very interested in their watches or phones. Theo's hand moved faster, capturing the moment when fear first showed in Charles's eyes. The artist recognized this moment, when the powerful realize their power exists only through the compliance of others. His gallery in Brooklyn was led with similar moments: the fall of dictators, the crumbling of empires, the triumph of truth over authority. "Mr. Whitman," Tiana spoke again, her voice steady. "Look around you. Really look. How many of us have you insulted, belittled, or dismissed? How many stories like mine are waiting to be told?" Theo's sketches caught the reactions. Servers exchanging knowing looks, guests whispering behind hands, the subtle nods of agreement from unexpected quarters. One sketch showed a young socialite removing her expensive necklace, suddenly conscious of its weight. Ruth moved to stand beside Tiana, her red dress a stark contrast to Tiana's black uniform. "I have my card here," she announced to the room at large. "Anyone who has experienced similar treatment is welcome to contact my office. Class action suits can be particularly effective in cases like these." Charles's face drained of color. Theo captured this too. The moment when a man realizes his kingdom is built on sand. The artist's strokes became more urgent, trying to capture every detail of this unfolding drama. The other servers began to move, no longer hugging the walls. They formed a loose circle around the stage, their presence impossible to ignore. Theo's sketches showed their transformation, from background furniture to human beings demanding recognition. "I've seen this before," Ruth continued, her voice carrying authority earned from years in courtrooms. "The wealthy and powerful convince themselves that their position gives them the right to dehumanize others. But times change, Mr. Whitman. The voiceless find their voice. The invisible become visible." Theo started a new sketch, this one larger, more detailed. It showed Tiana and Ruth on stage. The servers gathered around them, Charles isolated and diminished. Behind them, through the ballroom's grand windows, he drew the New York skyline, a reminder that beyond these walls, the city was changing too. The tension in the room had reached a fever pitch. Charles stood frozen, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The crowd waited, watching as history wrote itself in real time. Theo's charcoal moved faster, trying to capture every nuance of this pivotal moment. In the corner, the band had stopped playing, but nobody noticed the silence. The only sound was the soft scratch of Theo's charcoal on paper, recording this moment when power began to shift, when the foundations of privilege began to shake, when truth spoke louder than money. "Let me tell you what dignity looks like." Tiana's voice filled the ballroom, no longer just speaking, but commanding attention. "Dignity is serving your champagne with a smile, while my college degree in fine arts hangs on my wall at home. Dignity is watching you mock my dreams while I paint masterpieces between double shifts. Dignity is standing here now, telling the truth, even as you try to silence me." The microphone trembled slightly in her hand, but her voice remained steady. Behind her, a projection screen originally intended for a charity presentation now cast her elongated shadow across the room, a towering figure of defiance against the opulent backdrop. "I am not alone," she continued, gesturing to her fellow servers who had gathered near the stage. "Maria, who you fired, she's starting her own business now. James, who you mocked for his accent, he has a master's degree in engineering. We are not your punchlines, Mr. Whitman. We are not your property." Charles lunged forward again, but this time several guests physically stepped between him and the stage. Among them was Gerald Robertson, one of his oldest board members. "Sit down, Charles," Gerald said firmly. "For once in your life, listen." Ruth seized the moment, her legal mind recognizing the shift in power. "Would anyone else like to share their experiences?" she asked, addressing the service staff directly. "Now is the time. You are protected under whistleblower laws." One by one, hands began to raise. A kitchen worker stepped forward, then a valet, then a maintenance worker. Each had a story, each had documentation. Phones emerged from pockets, recording every word. "You can't do this," Charles sputtered, but his protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I'll have you all fired." "Fire everyone, Charles?" A woman in her 60s stood up, Margaret Whitman, his own sister and major shareholder in the family business. "And then what? How long before the press gets hold of this? How many lawsuits can the foundation weather?" Theo continued sketching frantically, capturing Margaret's intervention, another crack in Charles's facade of control. His artistry caught the subtle shifts. The way other wealthy donors began distancing themselves from Charles, the growing confidence in the servers' postures, the way the security guards had switched from watching the crowd to watching Charles himself. "I demand respect," Charles shouted, his composure completely shattered. "Respect is earned," Tiana replied calmly. "And you, Mr. Whitman, have earned exactly what you gave, nothing." The room erupted in applause. Not the polite, society applause of charity galas, but the raw, genuine approval of humans recognizing truth. Even some board members were clapping now, perhaps seeing the writing on the wall, perhaps finally finding their own courage. "Here's what's going to happen." Ruth stepped forward, her legal training evident in every word. "The Whitman Foundation will undergo a complete audit of its employment practices. All staff will receive back pay for unpaid overtime. A new board committee for ethical oversight will be established, with representation from all levels of employees." Charles opened his mouth to object, but Margaret cut him off. "I second these proposals," she announced, "and I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current leadership." The room buzzed with tension as Charles looked around wildly, searching for allies and finding none. The kingdom he built on privilege and fear was crumbling in real time, its foundations eaten away by years of accumulated truth. Tiana stood tall, her black uniform now seeming more like armor than a mark of servitude. "We're not asking for charity, Mr. Whitman. We're demanding justice. The days of silent suffering are over. Welcome to the new world." The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. Charles's own son, Timothy, who had been quietly observing from the back, walked to the stage. He took off his expensive jacket and handed it to a shocked Charles. "Here, Dad," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You might need this more than I do. I quit the board. I stand with them." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Theo's charcoal captured the moment. The father clutching his son's discarded jacket, the son standing with the servers, the old guard giving way to the new. Power wasn't just shifting, it was being completely redefined. The grand ballroom had transformed from a showcase of wealth into an impromptu forum on social justice. The careful segregation between servers and served had dissolved, replaced by clusters of people engaged in urgent conversation. Crystal champagne flutes sat forgotten on tables as reality intruded into the carefully curated world of high society. "Do you understand what's happening here?" Ruth addressed the crowd, her voice carrying the weight of decades fighting similar battles. "This isn't just about one man's behavior or one foundation's practices. This is about a system that has normalized discrimination under the guise of tradition." Charles Whitman sat alone at his table, his son's jacket still clutched in his hands, watching his influence evaporate like champagne left in the sun. Board members who had laughed at his jokes hours earlier now huddled in corners, making urgent phone calls to their lawyers. A young socialite, Jessica Monroe, stood up shakily. I need to say something. Last month at the Metropolitan Opera fundraiser, I made a joke about my housekeeper's English. I thought it was harmless. I was wrong. I am sorry." Her voice cracked. "How do we do better?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Tiana stepped forward again, her initial anger now tempered with purpose. "It starts with seeing us, really seeing us, not as background characters in your lives, but as people with our own stories, our own dreams, our own value." Around the room, other guests began to shift uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own casual cruelties, their own unexamined privileges. A prominent museum director removed his expensive watch, turning it over in his hands as if seeing it for the first time. The foundation's annual report boasts about diversity, One board member spoke up, his face flushed with shame. But look at this room. Look at who's standing where. We've been congratulating ourselves for maintaining the very systems we claim to want to change. The debate spread through the room like ripples in a pond. Some guests defended the status quo, arguing about merit and tradition, but their voices sounded hollow against the raw truth that had been exposed. My grandfather was a janitor, another board member admitted, standing slowly. I've spent years trying to hide that fact. I changed my accent, changed my name, tried to fit in, and in doing so, I became part of the problem. Charles attempted one last time to regain control. This is ridiculous. You're all being manipulated by what, Charles? Margaret cut him off. By the truth? By the consequences of your own actions? Look around you. The world is changing. The question is whether we change with it or get left behind. Near the bar, a group of younger guests had gathered around Theo, watching as he showed them his sketches of the evening. This is history, one young woman said, touching a drawing of Tiana at the microphone. This is what change looks like. The hotel's general manager appeared, drawn by the commotion. He surveyed the scene. The mingling of servers and guests, the passionate discussions, the isolated figure of Charles Whitman, and made a decision. He walked to Tiana and offered his hand. Ms. Williams, he said formally, I believe we need to discuss your future. Perhaps a position in event management? Your leadership tonight has been illuminating. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. In trying to maintain his power, Charles had inadvertently created the circumstances for real change. The carefully maintained walls between social classes had cracked, and through those cracks, new possibilities were emerging. Ruth watched it all, her phone still recording. She'd seen movements start this way before, not with grand gestures or political declarations, but with moments of truth that couldn't be ignored or denied. The wealthy guests who had arrived in luxury cars were now facing questions they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. This isn't just about tonight, Tiana addressed the room again. This is about tomorrow, and the day after, and every day when someone decides they're worth more than someone else because of their position or their wealth. This is about changing the story we tell ourselves about who deserves dignity and respect. The night was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. The comfortable illusions of the privileged had been shattered, replaced by uncomfortable truths and the beginning of real dialogue. In the corner, Charles Whitman continued to shrink, his power evaporating in the face of authenticity and courage. As the night deepened, the ballroom transformed into something resembling a grassroots organizing meeting. Tables were pushed together, creating informal discussion circles. Servers had removed their uniform jackets, sitting alongside guests as equals. Theo had set up an impromptu exhibition of his sketches on one wall, documenting the evening's transformation in star. Black and white. We need to make this more than just a moment, Ruth announced, standing at a central table with her laptop open. I'm drafting a preliminary action plan. We need commitments, not just conversations. Tiana, Ruth, and Theo had formed a natural leadership trio. They sat at what had been the head table, now joined by Timothy Whitman and several other younger board members. The energy had shifted from confrontation to construction. The foundation's annual budget is $50 million, Timothy revealed, loosening his tie. That's more than enough to implement real change. We've been using it to maintain the status quo, but imagine what we could do if we actually invested in our people. Margaret Whitman approached their table, her iPad in hand. I've been reviewing our employment practices, she said, her face grim. Charles didn't just underpay the staff. He actively suppressed attempts at organization. We found emails. The revelation sparked another wave of activity. Ruth began typing rapidly, documenting potential legal violations. Theo captured the scene in his sketchbook. Margaret standing over the table, her usual society posture replaced by genuine concern, while around her, former servers and guests worked together on laptops and phones. I want to propose something, Tiana said, her voice clear and confident. The foundation has that empty building on West 23rd Street. What if we turned it into a community arts center? A place where service workers could showcase their talents, where people could learn, where barriers could break down. The suggestion caught fire immediately. An architect in the crowd offered to draw up preliminary plans. A tech entrepreneur started talking about digital accessibility. The president of a local bank discussed funding options. Charles Whitman had disappeared from the room entirely, but nobody seemed to notice or care. His absence only highlighted how little his presence had actually mattered. The real power had always been in the collective potential he'd worked so hard to suppress. We need to think about immediate needs too. A former server named James spoke up. Health insurance, educational opportunities, childcare support. These aren't luxuries, they're basic rights. The hotel's general manager, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. Starting tomorrow, we're reviewing all our staffing policies. Ms. Williams, would you be willing to serve on our advisory board? Your perspective would be invaluable. Tiana nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead to bigger possibilities. She pulled out her phone and showed Theo photos of her artwork. Powerful pieces that captured the dignity of service workers, the beauty in their daily struggles. This is incredible, Theo said, studying the images. Listen, I have a gallery show opening next month. How would you feel about a joint exhibition? Your work deserves to be seen. Ruth overheard and added, and we can use the opening to launch the foundation's new initiatives. Make it both an artistic and social statement. Around the room, similar connections were forming. A sommelier was discussing wine education programs with a restaurant owner. A housekeeper was showing her poetry to a publishing executive. The artificial barriers that had separated them were dissolving, replaced by genuine human connection. We need to document this, Theo said, still sketching. Not just the conflict, but what comes after. The real work, the real change. The night was growing late, but nobody seemed eager to leave. The usual social obligations that would have drawn people away, other parties, other commitments seemed trivial now. Something more important was happening, something that required their full attention and engagement. Tomorrow, Ruth announced, we start the legal work. But tonight, we're witnessing something remarkable. We're seeing what happens when people stop accepting the world as it is and start imagining what it could be. Tiana looked around the room, at the unlikely allies and emerging partnerships, at the way art and activism and business were beginning to intertwine. The Foundation's Gala had become something else entirely. Not an end, but a beginning. Ruth's legal pad had become the center of attention, covered with action items and commitments. She'd spent years watching well-meaning initiatives fade into nothing, and she wasn't about to let this moment slip away into mere good intentions. Accountability, she said firmly, addressing the gathered group. That's what makes the difference between performance and progress. We need concrete commitments, timelines, and oversight. Margaret Whitman stepped forward with her own announcement. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I move to freeze Charles's access to Foundation resources effective immediately. Timothy will serve as interim director. The younger Whitman looked startled but determined. On one condition, he said, we create a new board structure. Half the seats go to staff representatives. Real power sharing, not just advisory roles. Around the room, people had broken into working groups. Theo moved between them, documenting the scene in his sketchbook, a former server and a hedge fund manager mapping out educational programs, a sommelier and a tech entrepreneur designing a skill-sharing platform, Tiana and a museum curator planning the community arts center. We need to think about sustainability, Ruth continued. This can't just be a one-time response to a crisis. We need structural change. She began outlining specific proposals. 1. Immediate audit of all employment practices. 2. Creation of an employee advocacy office. 3. Transparent salary scales and promotion paths. 4. Educational support programs. 5. Healthcare benefits expansion. 6. Art and cultural development initiatives. A prominent tax attorney raised her hand. I can help structure this legally. We can create a separate entity for the community programs, protect them from future administrative changes. The hotel's general manager had been making his own notes. We're not just changing the foundation, he announced. Every hotel in our chain needs to review its practices. Ms. Williams, would you consider consulting with our corporate office? Tiana looked up from her discussion with the museum curator. Yes, but not alone. We need a team of voices, different perspectives, and everything we develop needs to be shared openly, available to other organizations. Ruth nodded approvingly. She'd seen too many movements fracture because of competing egos and hidden agendas. But this felt different. The very public nature of the confrontation, combined with the wealth and influence in the room, created unique opportunities for lasting change. "We need to think about media strategy," a PR executive offered. "Not to control the narrative, but to amplify these initiatives. People need to see what's possible when we break down barriers." Theo had set up an impromptu gallery of his sketches from the evening, creating a visual timeline of transformation. "This is just the beginning," he said, adding final touches to a drawing of the working groups. "Art can document change, but it can also inspire it." The night's events had already started spreading beyond the ballroom. Hashtag Whitman Gala Reckoning was trending on social media. Other organizations were reaching out, some defensive, others curious about implementing similar changes. "Charles will fight back," Margaret warned. "He has allies, other old money families who won't want this kind of change spreading." "Let them fight," Ruth replied calmly. "Everything we're doing is legal, ethical, and long overdue." Sometimes the biggest weapon against privilege is simply forcing it into the light. A young lawyer who had been quietly taking notes spoke up. "We should prepare for backlash. Document everything. Create secure CH&Ls for reporting harassment or retaliation." The energy in the room remained focused, but had evolved from angry confrontation to determined action. People who had arrived as anonymous servers or privileged guests were now partners in something larger than themselves. "Tomorrow," Ruth announced, "we start the formal work. Tonight, we make our commitments public." She held up her phone, still recording. "Everyone who's ready to put their name to these changes, step forward." One by one, people moved to declare themselves. Board members, donors, staff, each bringing their own resources and perspectives to the emerging movement. The night was ending, but something much bigger was just beginning. "This isn't charity," Tiana reminded everyone. "This is justice. This is what should have been happening all along." Ruth's phone buzzed with an incoming email. Her face hardened as she read it. Then she stood up, commanding attention without speaking a word. "Charles just sent a mass email to the board. He's threatening to expose embarrassing personal information about anyone who supports these changes. He thinks he can still control this through fear." The room fell silent, but only for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, laughter erupted, starting with Timothy Whitman and spreading across the gathered crowd. The threat that would have caused panic hours ago now seemed almost pathetically outdated. "I have something better than threats," Ruth announced, holding up her phone. "I have the truth. Every word spoken tonight. Every admission. Every promise." But more importantly, she nodded to Tiana, who pulled out her worn notebook. 15 years of documentation, Tiana said clearly. Every discriminatory comment. Every illegal practice. Every moment of harassment. All dated, all witnessed, all real. She placed a notebook on the table. "And I'm not the only one who kept records." Other servers stepped forward, producing their own evidence, photos, recordings, written accounts. Years of careful documentation by people who knew that someday they would need to prove their truth. "Charles always assumed we were too afraid or too stupid to protect ourselves," one of the kitchen staff said. "He never realized we were just waiting for the right moment." Ruth's legal training kicked in. "What we have here is a clear pattern of discrimination, harassment, and labor law violations. Mr. Whitman can threaten all he wants, but he's the one who should be worried about exposure." Margaret Whitman stepped forward again. "I've just received messages from 3 other major donors. They're doubling their commitments to the foundation, specifically to support our new initiatives. They want to be on the right side of history." The hotel's general manager cleared his throat. "And I've just gotten approval from corporate. We're implementing immediate changes across all our properties. Ms. Williams, they'd like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss a company-wide training program." Theo had been working on a large-scale sketch throughout this exchange. Now he stepped back, revealing a powerful image. The ballroom transformed, barriers broken, human dignity restored. "This is going up in my gallery next week," he announced. "The first piece in a new collection, The Night Power Changed Hands." Charles burst back into the ballroom, his face contorted with rage, waving his phone. You think you can destroy everything I've built? I'll ruin all of you. You'll what, Charles? Ruth's voice cut through his threats. Sue us for telling the truth? Call your friends in high places? Look around. Those friends are here, and they're not standing with you anymore. Indeed, Charles's entrance had barely caused a ripple. The working groups continued their discussions, barely acknowledging his presence. His power had evaporated not through dramatic confrontation, but through simple irrelevance. The press will be here in 10 minutes, a former D member announced. They're not coming for a society page story about a charity gala. They're coming for a story about transformation, about justice, about the future. Tiana stood up, her posture straight, her voice clear. Mr. Whitman, you have a choice. You can fight us, waste your money on lawyers, damage your reputation further. Or you can do what you've demanded of us for years. Step aside quietly and let progress happen. The room held its breath. Charles looked around wildly, seeking any remaining allies. Finding none, he seemed to physically deflate. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the ballroom. This time his exit was final. Now, Ruth said, returning to her legal pad, let's finish what we started. We have about 300 seconds to turn a moment into a movement. Who's ready to put their name on the right side of history? The response was immediate and overwhelming. Board members, donors, staff, guests, each stepping forward to sign their names to the commitments they'd developed. The foundation's transformation was no longer just a possibility. It was becoming reality. Theo captured the final scene in his sketchbook. Tiana and Ruth standing together at the main table. Margaret and Timothy Whitman beside them, surrounded by a diverse group of supporters all signing their names to a new future. In the background, through the ballroom's grand windows, the first light of dawn was beginning to break over New York City. The night that began with cruel jokes and enforced hierarchies was ending with something revolutionary. Genuine human connection, shared purpose, and the proof that change was not only possible, but inevitable when people found the courage to stand together.